Ever heard the phrase, live by the sword, die by the sword? Well, what if I told you most samurai didn't even use swords that often? What if their greatest battles weren't on blood-soaked fields, but in rice ledgers and land disputes? Welcome to Mild History, where the pace is gentle, the tone is dry, and your misconceptions are about to be quietly dismantled. Before we get going, what are you doing right now? Folding laundry, commuting, procrastinating in the name of learning? Whatever it is, thanks for letting this video be the background to your brain. And if you're still here in a few minutes, let me know in the comments what you're up to, or what caught you off guard. Let's begin. A lone samurai stands at dawn, armor glinting, katana at his side, the wind tugging at his topknot as cherry blossoms fall in slow motion. It's beautiful and misleading, because the average samurai was more likely to be worrying about land tax records than engaging in mist-shrouded duels. He might have gone his whole life without drawing a sword. He probably smelled like ink. And his greatest battle? A property dispute. That's the thing about history. It hardens into myth, then gets lacquered with style. And few myths have been polished more than that of the samurai. So today, let's peel that lacquer off. Gently, like a museum conservator removing layers of assumption, and see what the wood underneath actually looks like. The word samurai comes from saburao, meaning to serve. And serve they did, but not just with blades. In early Japan, the emperor held symbolic power, but the court in Kyoto couldn't control the sprawling countryside. So local clans filled the gap. They hired men to protect land, collect taxes, and enforce rule. These men became the military class. By the late Heian period, 794 to 1185, these warriors began consolidating power, especially two clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. They weren't rebels. They were subcontractors. But eventually, contractors decide they can do the job better than the client. After decades of skirmishes, the Minamoto came out on top, establishing Japan's first military government, the shogunate. The emperor stayed on his throne, but the samurai now ran the show. This was around 1192, and for the next 650 years, give or take, Japan would be ruled not by royals, but by warriors. But what did warrior mean? Let's pause here. Because when we say samurai, we tend to picture a soldier, someone who lived by the sword. But being a samurai wasn't a job. It was a status, a social class. And that class, it included warriors, yes, but also administrators, accountants, poets, monks, and judges. You could be a samurai and never go near a battlefield. You could be a samurai and be bored out of your mind. Samurai were hereditary elites. They passed down land, stipends, and rice. And what defined them wasn't just the katana, but the right to wear it. Yes, swords matter. But not because they were always used. They were symbols. Legal proof of authority. A samurai's blades were his license, his badge. It's a bit like a modern police officer. The uniform doente mean daily gunfix. It means success. Power. Status. So what did a samurai actually do? Well, during times of war, they fought. Or at least, some of them did. But during the long stretches of peace, particularly under the Tokugawa shogunate, 1603 to 1868, their role shifted. Warriors became bureaucrats. They oversaw land, mediated conflicts, read Confucian philosophy, taught their sons to do the same. It was expected that a samurai be literate, cultured, that he compose poetry, appreciate calligraphy, recite the classics, debate ethics, understand taxation. Many served as scribes, tax officers, local magistrates. They maintained order not with blades, but with paperwork. This is not to say samurai forgot how to fight. Martial arts were still part of their training, but it was as much ritual as readiness, more ceremony than survival. And then, there's the katana. Let's be honest. The katana is beautiful, sleek, balanced, almost mystical in its design. It cuts through bamboo and through centuries of marketing. But here's the truth. For much of samurai history, the primary battlefield weapon wasn't the katana, it was the bow, or the spear, or even the naginata, a curved blade on a long pole. Swords were often the last resort. And the most famous style of sword, the curved katana, didn't become standard until the late medieval period. Earlier swords were straight, more suited to slashing on horseback. The shift to the katana came with changes in armor, tactics, and aesthetics.
And yet, in popular imagination, the katana is the soul of the samurai.
In reality, it was more often a marker of status than a tool of violence. Like wearing a stethoscope when you haven't practiced medicine in years. So where does this romantic image of the samurai come from? Strangely enough, it crystallized just as the samurai were vanishing. In the late 1800s, during the Meiji Restoration, Japan modernized. Feudal domains were abolished. Samurai stipends were cut. The class system was dismantled. And many samurai, proud, educated, and suddenly unemployed, found themselves obsolete. Some revolted. Some adapted. But culturally, Japan began to mourn them. That mourning took form in nostalgia, in literature, art, education. The idea of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was codified during this time, not as a lived code, but as a eulogy, a national myth. Books like Hagakure and Bushido, The Soul of Japan, shaped this narrative. They spoke of loyalty, self-sacrifice, and honor unto death. They described the samurai as they should have been, not necessarily as they were. And thus, the myth hardened.
Deloy el sportsman.
The stoic duelist. The warrior poet. It's not that these figures didn't exist. It's that they weren't the rule. They were the highlight reel. But perhaps that's the nature of legacy. We remember ideals, not averages. We sculpt statues from fragments. We build meaning out of memory. And the samurai, in their complexity, gave Japan centuries of governance, war, poetry, and bureaucracy. They were not one thing. They were a class, with contradictions, ambitions, and plenty of rice paperwork.
So the next image you picture a lone warrior in the mist, katana drawn, eyes sharp, destiny looming, remember.
He probably had a ledger to fill out later. And he probably complained about his stipend. Because the truth of the samurai isn't just honor and swords. It's tax policy. It's legal authority. It's living in a system that asked for dignity and demanded obedience.
The code being the sword, Bushido and the invention of honor.
Before we begin, let's set something straight. The samurai code wasn't downloaded one day like a PDF titled
Bushido-oficial-final, final 2, Doc X.
It evolved over centuries through war, bureaucracy, poetry, and, we kid you not, etiquette manuals.
So let's talk about Bushido, the so-called way of the warrior. The name alone is magnetic.
It conjures images of silent swordsmen, rigid posture, cherry blossoms, and death before dishonor. But the truth?
Messy, gray,
and mildly disappointing. Which, if you've been watching this documentary, is kind of our brand. The word Bushido didn't even exist until well after the samurai had been running the place for a while. The earliest warriors had no need for philosophical codes. They needed land, allies, and clean sword strokes. That's it. Early samurai were pragmatic.
Flexible.
If loyalty served them, great.
If betrayal path better?
Well, rice is rice. But as the samurai class gained power, and especially after they stopped fighting every other Tuesday, they needed a way to justify their existence.
You can't use twin swords forever.
Eventually someone asks, wait, why are we still paying these guys? And so, slowly, a moral code emerged. Partly, this came from Confucianism. The whole loyalty to your lord, filial piety, know your place hierarchy thing? Classic Confucian. Then there's Zen Buddhism. This one added the stillness.
The silence. de meditation.
It helped warriors focus before battle. It also helped them not panic when their heads were about to be cut off. Toss in some Shintoism, the native spirituality of Japan, and now you've got divine ancestry, spiritual purity, and a deep respect for nature.
Out of this to come something vaguely resembling a code.
What did it say? Well, not officially, again, no PDFs. But the values generally included
Loyalty to your lord, your family, your death. Honor public reputation matter.
a lot. Courage, not just in battle but in duty. Self-discipline. Samurai were not to be sloppy. In anything. Justice, not always legal justice, but personal, sometimes poetic. Benevolence, especially toward the weak, when convenient. Politeness, you could stab someone, but at least bow first. Bushido was equal parts ethics, aesthetics, and performance. It was about being seen to do the right thing. Whether or not you were actually doing it was secondary. Now let's talk about seppuku, also known as ritual suicide. It's the part of Bushido that Westerners fixate on, the whole disembowelment thing. But it wasn't just gruesome performance. It was, weirdly, about control. If a samurai failed or dishonored themselves, they could choose to die with dignity, on their own terms. They would write a poem, prepare a clean space,
Dress in white.
cut their stomach, and a trusted friend would finish the job with a clean beheading. It was loyalty, courage, discipline, all in one horrifying ceremony. Also, not everyone did it.
Some got away with exile.
Others bribed their way out. Bushido was flexible when it needed to be. The most famous case of samurai loyalty is the 47 Ronin, and it's worth a quick detour. Their lord was forced to commit seppuku after an insult. They waited, planned, avenged him, then turned themselves in. All of Edo Japan was gripped. It was the original slow burn revenge saga. The government didn't know what to do. Punish them. They were criminals. Praise them. They were loyal.
In the end,
All 47 were allowed to commit seppuku and were buried together. Their grave site, still visited today. Bushido wasn't just philosophy. It was theater. And audiences loved it. But here's where it gets mildly ironic. Bushido was most clearly defined after the age of samurai had basically ended.
de Tokugawa Shogunate, 1603-1868, brought peace.
Lots of it. Samurai became bureaucrats, teachers, poets.
Saketastes.
They weren't drawing swords on the battlefield anymore. They were drawing up tax ledgers. So how do you justify your elite status when you're basically middle management with a katana?
Jurait about honor.
Bushido became the identity anchor, not because it was practiced perfectly, but because it preserved the myth of who samurai should be. This is when actual manuals start appearing. Texts like Hagakure, Hidden Leaves, and the Book of Five Rings started telling samurai how to behave. Spoiler, most of them were already behaving that way, or faking it. Hagakure in particular is full of strange, poetic, and sometimes chilling lines like, "The way of the samurai is found in death." It's dramatic. It's vague. It's Instagram ready. But it also reflects the internal crisis of a warrior class, with no war. Bushido was aspirational, a mirror held up to a fading image of glory. By the late 19th century, when Japan began modernizing, the samurai class was officially abolished. Their stipends, gone. Their swords, confiscated. Their hair, cut. But Bushido didn't die. It was repackaged, used by nationalist thinkers, taught to soldiers, embedded into military education. It became part of Japan's imperial identity, especially in the 1930s and 40s. Loyalty,
Sacrifice. No surrender. Al rapting the noble imagery of the samurai past.
and that's the real twist.
The Bushido we know today?
It's not the code they lived by. It's the code they were remembered by. It's mythology, back-filled ethics. A way to make sense of a class that ruled, faded, and left behind very sharp swords and very neat handwriting. But even if the code was built after the fact, the values it promoted and the aura it created still shape how we see Japan, still shapes how many see themselves. So the next time you hear about honor and the samurai way, remember, it wasn't chiseled in stone. It was scribbled in marginalia, but it endured. Because sometimes, ideas outlast empires. The rise of the warrior class, land, loyalty, and quiet takeovers. So, here's a surprise. The samurai didn't storm into power with swords drawn and banners waving. They crept in, like moss, slowly, quietly, and then they never left. To understand how samurai became the samurai, we need to talk about land. Japan, in the 8th and 9th centuries, wasn't some grand unified empire. It was a patchwork of rice paddies, misty hills, and very ambitious landowners. The imperial court, based in Kyoto, technically ruled the land. But what they really ruled was ritual, poems,
elaborat robes,
paperwork. The real power started slipping toward the countryside, toward local clans, toward those who could defend their fields when the tax collectors came calling, or when bandits decided they preferred free rice. And thus, a new class emerged, the bushi, warrior landowners. They weren't noble by blood. They were noble by blade. And by rice. Always rice. These early warriors weren't just fighters. They were estate managers, tax enforcers, a strange hybrid of soldier and spreadsheet. And they didn't shout about their rise. They whispered it. Through alliances, marriages,
favor exchanges,
sword gifts, all very subtle. Imagine a medieval HR department meets Game of Thrones, but everyone is deeply repressed and very, very into family crests. By the 10th century, these warriors had begun organizing into extended family units called uji. These weren't just families. They were armed corporations. You had headmen, retainers, loyalty oaths, and a shared sense of pride, even when your cousin was objectively terrible at swordplay. Then came the Heian period, a cultural high point for Japan and a low point for centralized control. While Kyoto produced poetry about dew on lotus petals, the provinces were producing armored men who cared more about wet boots and blade sharpness. Here's where it gets mildly fascinating. The samurai didn't invent themselves. They were commissioned. Originally, the imperial court hired warriors to keep the peace. These private guards and enforcers were often drawn from powerful clans. It was outsourcing, but with katanas. Except over time, the outsourced became the owners. Clans like the Taira and the Minamoto began to dominate this freelance warrior scene. They weren't just defending estates. They were defending their own growing power, often from each other. So, now you had armies. Not national armies, but clan armies. Led by men who'd been raised in the arts of archery, horseback riding, and paperwork. Always paperwork. They believed in loyalty, but to family, not emperor. They believed in honor, but also in winning. This slow consolidation set the stage for Japan's first major samurai-led civil war, the Hagen Rebellion in 1156. It was brief,
brutal,
and profoundly anticlimactic. Two rival factions, each supported by warrior clans, fought over imperial succession. You know, classic, who sits on the throne, drama. But in the background, the real story was this. The warriors had arrived.
On the battlefield.
In politics. In history. 3 years later, another mini-civil war. The Heiji Rebellion. More betrayal. More burning palaces. More power slipping away from Kyoto and toward the men with bows and shaved foreheads. Then came the big one, the Genpei War, 1180 to 1185.
Taira vs Minamoto.
This wasn't just clan-on-clan violence. This was the birthing cry of samurai Japan. The Taira clan, elegant and aristocratic, made the mistake of believing their courtly manners would protect them. The Minamoto, rougher around the edges, preferred results. After 5 bloody years and several decisive sea battles, the Minamoto won. The Taira were effectively destroyed. And in 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo became Japan's first shogun, military dictator. Let's pause.
The emperor still existed.
Still wore robes. Still wrote poetry. But real power. That now belonged to the shogunate. To the military government based in Kamakura. This wasn't a palace, it was a fortified compound. This wasn't imperial rule, it was martial administration. The samurai had gone from freelance fighters to full-time rulers. And they weren't going back. Now, this transformation didn't happen overnight. It took generations. But the shift was seismic. Power was no longer tied to bloodline alone. It was tied to service, to loyalty, and to the ability to swing a sword and keep taxes flowing. The samurai became a class. A legal category.
A social identity.
They were given land in exchange for service. They were expected to follow codes of behavior. And their rise wasn't just military, it was bureaucratic. Land surveys, tax rolls,
chain of command.
The katana gets the glory, but the ink brush built the system. What's mildly tragic is that many early samurai didn't live for glory. They lived for rice quotas, for border skirmishes, for the approval of men who sat behind low tables and silently judged your calligraphy. They fought, yes, but more often they managed. They negotiated. They married their daughters into rival clans. The greatest weapon in early samurai politics wasn't the blade. It was the family tree. This wasn't the era of lone warriors with perfect hair fighting for honor under the moonlight. This was the era of contracts, feudal obligations, and rain-soaked armor that smelled terrible. And that's what makes it interesting. The samurai were not born mythic. They became mythic, but only after generations of deeply practical maneuvering, full of land swaps, backroom deals, and the occasional arrow. By the 13th century, the samurai were no longer just a military class. They were Japan's ruling class. But what do you do once you have power?
You codify.
And that's what we'll look at next. Of castles and catastrophes, the Warring States period unleashed. Japan didn't always look like Japan. Not the way we picture it now, temples and trains and orderly lines at convenience stores. For over a century, it looked more like Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, and with significantly more rice. Welcome to the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, roughly 1467 to 1600. It was loud, bloody, and wildly inefficient. Also, it made samurai what they were meant to be, and nearly destroyed the country in the process. So how did we get here? Simple. The government collapsed. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had been running the show for a couple centuries, lost control. And by lost control, we mean they couldn't enforce tax collection. They couldn't stop local lords from raising armies. They couldn't even stop nobles from storming Kyoto repeatedly. That's the medieval Japanese equivalent of someone kicking in the White House door and declaring it a hostile.
The tipping point.
The Unin War, 1467 to 1477, a succession dispute that quickly spiraled into civil war. Kyoto burned.
Authority disintegrated.
And Japan broke into dozens of rival domains, each led by a daimyo, warlords with armies, ambitions, and very few chill buttons. Now, this wasn't just war for war's sake. The Sengoku period was survival of the fittest, sharpest, sneakiest. Samurai flourished, finally doing the thing they were trained for.
Not paperwork.
Not tea.
War.
But it wasn't elegant duels under cherry blossoms. It was sieges.
Assassinations.
Betrayals. Family members stabbed at dinner. Imagine Monopoly if every property was a castle and everyone had swords. And speaking of castles, this was also the golden age of Japanese fortress building. Before, castles were mostly wooden outposts. But in Sengoku, they became sprawling, multi-tiered, stone-based military complexes designed to impress, defend, and intimidate. Castles like Himeji, Matsumoto, and Azuchi weren't just bases, they were statements. Visible power, carved into the landscape. If you had one, you were someone. If you didn't, you were probably setting up a tent somewhere hoping no one noticed. Samurai weren't just warriors now, they were managers of chaos. They oversaw logistics, armies,
Farming systems. Spy networks.
Yes, ninja did exist. No, they didn't vanish in smoke. But they did spy, sabotage, and occasionally poison wells. All very practical.
Guardimandi Dinebastien.
Guns were introduced by the Portuguese in the mid-1500s, and contrary to myth, samurai didn't reject them. They loved guns. Japan became one of the most heavily armed countries in the world, with thousands of matchlocks. If Bushido was the soul, gunpowder was the muscle. Now, let's meet the big players. Because this wasn't just chaos. It was structured chaos. With three names you'll hear again and again.
Oda Nobunaga Rusle Sinebate.
The kind of guy who'd invite a rival over for dinner and serve betrayal.
Toyotomi Hideyoshi de Peasant Jurose Topower. Strategic genius. Flamboyant taste in architecture.
Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient, methodical, and about as flashy as a tax form, but lethal when cornered. Together, these three, in order, would break the chaos, unite Japan, and then close it off from the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
First Kame Nobunaga.
He modernized armies, standardized firearms, crushed Buddhist warrior monks, burned down temples, and made enemies like it was a hobby. But he was also brilliant. He understood terrain, momentum, the value of mercenaries. And, fun fact, he once defeated a much larger army by blasting war drums all night to make them sleep deprived, then attacking at dawn. Petty. Yes. Effective. Absolutely. His reign ended, of course, in betrayal. One of his generals turned on him. Nobunaga committed seppuku in a burning temple. That's how Act I closes. Then comes Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's sandal-bearer turned supreme commander. He wasn't of noble birth, which was scandalous, but he was dazzling. He built Osaka Castle, launched a survey of the entire country, implemented a sword hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants to prevent uprisings. He also tried to invade Korea. Twice. It didn't go great. Japan underestimated Korean defenses, and the Chinese Navy, and the concept of winter. The campaigns were costly, brutal, and ultimately failed. Hideyoshi died during the second invasion, and Japan paused. Briefly.
Bekauseten Kame Tokugawa Ieyasu, de Serva Iber.
He waited, calculated, and after the dust settled from Hideyoshi's death, he made his move.
De Finals Showdown?
Battle of Sekigahara, 1600. The largest samurai battle in history. Over 150,000 troops.
Afagi Morning.
Secret deals. Betrayals mid-battle. And Ieyasu won. He became shogun in 1603, and thus began the Tokugawa shogunate, a peaceful dictatorship that would last over 250 years. The Sengoku era was over. So what did the Warring States period teach us? That chaos breeds transformation. Samurai went from horse-riding archers to armored infantry to firearm-wielding generals. They became politicians, strategists, city planners. The violence of the era wasn't just carnage, it was creative destruction. Laws were written, languages standardized, roads built, power centralized. It was brutal, but it laid the groundwork for everything Japan became. Still, there's something haunting about the Sengoku Jidai.
So many nameless warriors.
So many forgotten castles. So many decisions made at dawn that echoed for centuries. It's the kind of history that feels too big to grasp, yet too real to ignore. So we try. We narrate.
We reimagine.
And if you're still here, Congratulations! You just survived 100 years of civil war in under 20 minutes.
Juve earned a break. The calm after the sword, Tokugawa's peace and the samurai identity crisis.
The year is 1603, and Japan has done the unthinkable. It has stopped killing itself. After centuries of clan wars, castle sieges, and general chaos, Tokugawa Ieyasu steps in, unites the country, and tells everyone to please sit down. The warring states period is over.
No more civil war.
No more rival lords carving up the map. Just peace. For farmers, merchants, and anyone tired of watching their village burn every other harvest, this was fantastic news.
For the samurai?
It was complicated. Because for a warrior class built on battle, glory, and occasionally shouting at horses in the rain, peace wasn't just unfamiliar. It was existentially awkward. Imagine telling a Formula One driver the new career plan is knitting sweaters. The skill set doesn't exactly translate.
The sword is heavy when you stand in steel.
Under the Tokugawa shogunate, samurai were transformed from a roaming, battle-ready force into a fixed, bureaucratic class. They now served their daimyo, not on the battlefield, but in the castle, as administrators, accountants, and, on slow days, glorified paper pushers. Weapons were still worn, of course. Every samurai carried the daisho, the paired long katana and shorter wakizashi, but the swords became more a badge of rank than a tool of war. They were like a uniform you could never take off, even when your actual work involved reviewing rice tax ledgers. Some samurai handled the transition gracefully, trading military campaigns for poetry contests, tea ceremonies, and the art of looking dignified while doing very little. Others, not so much. The boredom of peace became a quiet enemy. The economy of idleness. Here's the thing, war might be dangerous, but it's also financially straightforward for warriors. You fight, you get paid, in land, loot, or stipends, and you have a clear purpose. Peace, however, was expensive, especially for the samurai. They were paid in koku, a unit of rice supposedly enough to feed one person for a year. But inflation, debt, and changing market prices meant a stipend that once kept a samurai's household afloat could suddenly leave him quietly selling family heirlooms. Unlike merchants, samurai couldn't legally take on side jobs in trade or crafts without risking disgrace. The rules were rigid.
Honor mattered.
Which is why some ended up in what you might call honor-adjacent activities, teaching swordsmanship to bored townsfolk, offering bodyguard services, or, if particularly desperate, becoming ronin, masterless samurai willing to freelance for whoever would hire them.
The identity crisis deepens.
The Tokugawa peace wasn't just long. It lasted over 250 years. That's 10 generations of samurai born into a world where most would never draw a sword in real combat. Some adapted, embracing the evolving code of Bushido, which in this era shifted from a practical warrior's manual to a moral and philosophical ideal. Loyalty, discipline, frugality, self-cultivation, these became the new battlegrounds. Others resented the change, muttering over sake cups about the real warriors of their grandfather's time, when honor was proven on muddy fields instead of in calligraphy classes. Arts of the swordless warrior. This was also the golden age of samurai involvement in Japan's cultural life. They became patrons and practitioners of no theater, ink painting, tea ceremony, and haiku poetry. Basho himself, Japan's most famous haiku poet, was of samurai descent. The tea ceremony, for example, wasn't just about drinking tea. It was a performance of etiquette, control, and stillness, all qualities prized in both war and peace. Samurai who once timed cavalry charges now perfected the precise folding of a silk cloth. Swordsmanship didn't disappear, of course. It evolved into structured schools and kata, prearranged forms practiced endlessly in dojos. Without real wars to test them, these schools sometimes drifted into the highly philosophical or even theatrical. The blade was still sharp, but it was as much a spiritual tool as a martial one.
When peace feels like a kage.
The rigid Tokugawa social hierarchy kept the samurai on top of the official ladder, just below the daimyo. Farmers came next, then artisans, then merchants at the very bottom. But while merchants were socially low, they were quietly amassing wealth through trade, rice speculation, and clever deals. Samurai, forbidden to engage in commerce, sometimes ended up borrowing money from the very people they were supposed to outrank. This led to tension
and humiliation.
There are records of indebted samurai pawning their armor or swords, not to fight, but to pay for essentials. To a class that valued status and appearance, this was its own quiet kind of defeat.
The ghost of the battlefield.
Even without wars, the idea of battle remained central to samurai identity. The shogunate encouraged loyalty and martial readiness, in case rebellion or foreign threat emerged. And so, military parades and ceremonial drills became a part of castle life, as much theater as preparation. Children of samurai were still trained in archery, swordplay, and horsemanship. They studied strategy from ancient Chinese texts and memorized military classics. But many would grow old without seeing real combat. The warrior's edge was being dulled, not by enemy blades, but by time.
Foreza do Winden.
In hindsight, Tokugawa peace was both a triumph and a slow countdown. It gave Japan stability, infrastructure, and cultural flourishing. But it also created a samurai class increasingly disconnected from its original purpose. When foreign ships, the black ships of Commodore Perry, appeared on Japan's horizon in the mid-19th century, it wasn't the hardened war veterans of old who stood on the shore. It was their distant descendants, holding centuries-old swords, wrapped in codes of honor that no longer fit the world closing in. The calm after the sword was long. It was refined. It was deeply, deeply polite. And for the samurai, it was also the beginning of the end.
The black ships and the last stand of the samurai. It begins with smoke on the horizon.
Not the smoke of burning villages or castle sieges. Japan hasn't seen those in over 2 centuries. But coal smoke, thick and black, rising from engines no Japanese eyes had ever witnessed.
The year is 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet, 4 American warships, glides into Edobai like an omen from another world.
They are painted black, belching steam, armed with cannons that could reach miles inland. To the Japanese, they become known simply as the Kurofune, the black ships. And in that moment, the world of the samurai begins to tilt.
The shogunate meets the steam age.
For the Tokugawa shogunate, Perry's arrival was more than a diplomatic nuisance, it was an existential crisis. Japan's entire system had been built on isolation. No foreign trade beyond carefully controlled Dutch and Chinese ports, no foreign missionaries, no outside ideas unless filtered through layers of censorship. The black ships shattered that illusion. They didn't knock politely. They demanded, with the casual confidence of industrial power, that Japan open its ports to American trade. The shogunate, unused to negotiating from weakness, found itself staring down technology it couldn't match. The samurai, keepers of Japan's martial pride, watched in silence as weapons of a new age made their swords look ornamental.
The uneasy awakening.
In the months after Perry's first visit, Japan entered an uneasy limbo. The shogunate tried to stall, negotiate, and save face. Samurai retainers whispered in castle halls about whether this foreign intrusion meant war, the kind their ancestors would have relished, or something stranger, a war they could not win with skill and courage alone. The arrival of the black ships sparked not just fear, but curiosity. Some samurai saw opportunity in foreign weapons, foreign learning. Others saw only humiliation, the proof that Japan's long peace had left it soft. Swords and rifles on the same field. By the time Perry returned in 1854, his fleet had grown larger. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, opening Japanese ports to American ships. Other Western nations quickly followed, and with them came trade, foreign advisors, and most unsettling to the samurai, guns that could be fired from hundreds of yards away. The clash of worlds wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. Samurai, trained for close combat, found themselves drilling alongside conscripts armed with rifles. The elegant archery ranges of castle towns now stood beside firing ranges. The katana was still worn, still revered, but in real battle, a musket could decide a fight long before the blade was drawn.
The shogunate under siege.
The opening of Japan deepened existing political cracks. Powerful clans in the southwest, particularly Satsuma and Chashu, began pushing for the overthrow of the shogunate, arguing that it had failed to protect Japan from foreign intrusion. Here, the samurai class found itself split. Some pledged loyalty to the Tokugawa, believing that preserving order was the highest duty. Others saw the shogunate as a relic, unfit for the industrial age. Young samurai began traveling abroad, studying Western military science, engineering, and politics, then returning home with a vision of a modern Japan. And between these factions, a dangerous tension built. Samurai versus samurai, not over land or clan honor this time, but over the very future of the nation.
Blood in the streets.
By the 1860s, this political struggle turned violent. Pro-imperial samurai carried out attacks on foreigners and shogunate officials in the name of Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Foreign reprisals were swift, and the shogunate's inability to control them further eroded its legitimacy. In Kyoto, assassinations became almost routine. Streets that had been quiet for centuries now ran red again, not with the massed slaughter of the Sengoku period, but with targeted killings, a dagger in a back alley, a sword stroke in a tea-house doorway.
De Bakumatsu era, de Enough de Shogunate, had begun. De Bosin War, the samurai's final battlefield.
In 1868, open conflict erupted between Tokugawa loyalists and the forces of the new Meiji government. This was the Boshin War, the last great conflict where samurai fought as a class. But it wasn't the kind of war their ancestors would recognize. Battles were now a strange hybrid, cannon fire and rifle volleys mixed with sudden charges of swordsmen. At Toba Fushimi, the imperial forces' use of modern artillery and disciplined musketry shattered the Tokugawa lines. Samurai bravery was no match for industrial firepower. One by one, Tokugawa strongholds fell. By the summer of 1869, the last loyalists had retreated to the northern island of Hokkaido, declaring the short-lived Republic of Ezo. Their stand ended at the Battle of Hakodate, where samurai on horseback charged directly into gunfire, more for honor than hope.
The last stand of Saik Takamori.
Even after the Meiji Restoration formally ended the shogunate, unrest simmered. The new government abolished the samurai stipends, banned the wearing of swords in public, and reorganized the military on Western lines. Many former samurai adapted, becoming officers, teachers, or businessmen. Others, especially those in rural domains, felt betrayed. In 1877, Seigo Takamori, a celebrated general of the Restoration and one of Japan's most respected samurai, led the Satsuma Rebellion, a desperate attempt to restore the warrior class's place in society. The rebellion ended in tragedy at the Battle of Shiroyama. Surrounded and outgunned by modern troops, Seigo's forces charged in a final assault. Most were cut down before reaching the enemy lines. Seigo himself, wounded, is said to have committed seppuku rather than be captured. The samurai spirit burned brightly one last time, and then, in practical terms, it was gone.
After the smoke clears.
The end of the samurai wasn't the end of their influence. Their ideals, loyalty, discipline, and honor were absorbed into Japan's new national identity. The sword was no longer a weapon of war, but a symbol. Bushido became less about battle and more about moral conduct, reshaped to serve a modern state. Yet, for those who had lived and died in the transition, the loss was profound. The world they had been born to serve, the castles, the lords, the endless readiness for battle, was gone. In its place was a nation racing into the modern age, its new warriors wearing uniforms, not armor. The black ships had done more than open Japan's ports. They had closed the door on the samurai's centuries-long chapter.
Legacy of the Blade, how the samurai spirit lives on.
The last sword has been sheathed. The last castle gate has closed. The samurai, as a political class, as a battlefield force, are gone. And yet, in some strange, stubborn way, they never really left. From armor to ideals. When the Meiji government dismantled the samurai class in the late 19th century, it didn't erase their memory. Instead, it repurposed them. The virtues that had once been lived on horseback and in castle corridors, loyalty, self-discipline, service, were rebranded as national virtues for a modern Japan. Bushido, the way of the warrior, underwent its own transformation. Originally, it wasn't a single, rigid code, but a loose set of ideals varying from clan to clan. By the early 20th century, intellectuals and nationalists distilled it into something clean, sharp, and marketable, a moral framework that could be taught in schools, printed in textbooks, even used to inspire factory workers. The sword was no longer an everyday tool of survival. It became a ceremonial object, a link to a mythic past.
De militari reimagines de samurai.
As Japan built its modern army and navy, it consciously wove samurai imagery into its identity. Officers posed with swords at their sides. Military drills emphasized endurance, obedience, and the readiness to sacrifice, all couched in the language of Bushido. During the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, newspapers compared Japanese soldiers to samurai defeating a much larger foe. The victory wasn't just military, it was symbolic. The West, which had once humbled Japan with the Black Ships, was now forced to take it seriously, and Japan sold the story as proof that the samurai spirit was alive in modern uniforms. But this romanticization had a darker side. In the lead-up to World War II, the government leaned heavily on the samurai image to demand unquestioning loyalty from its soldiers and citizens. Bushido became propaganda, and self-sacrifice for the emperor became a moral duty, a distortion of the older, more nuanced warrior ethos.
The sword in modern times.
After Japan's defeat in 1945, militarism was dismantled. The Allied occupation banned swords and dissolved the military. Yet, once again, the samurai's symbolic power adapted rather than vanished. The katana reappeared, not on battlefields, but in martial arts dojos, cultural ceremonies, and the hands of craftsmen preserving centuries-old forging techniques. Modern swordsmiths work under strict government regulation, producing blades not for war, but for art. Each one is a reminder that the samurai's legacy is as much about craft and discipline as it is about combat. Even the language carries echoes. Words like seppuku, ronin, and bushido remain instantly recognizable, not just in Japan but worldwide. Pop culture and the global samurai myth.
Te enteres de Samurai Second Life, in the realm of imagination.
Kurosawa films like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo reintroduced the warrior's image to a post-war audience, blending gritty realism with timeless drama.
In the West, these stories inspired everything from the Magnificent Seven to Star Wars.
The Jedi, with their robes, sabers, and codes, are sci-fi samurai in all but name. Anime, manga, and video games have since carried the samurai myth to every corner of the globe. Whether portrayed as stoic heroes, tragic wanderers, or supernatural warriors, the samurai archetype remains instantly compelling, a shorthand for honor in a chaotic world. But this pop culture revival often blends fact and fiction freely. The historical samurai were politicians, bureaucrats, tax collectors, not just lone swordsmen wandering misty roads. Yet the romantic image endures because it speaks to something deeper: the human fascination with purpose, discipline, and the willingness to stand for something, even at great cost.
Everyday echoes in Japan.
In modern Japan, you can still feel the samurai's presence if you know where to look. Annual festivals feature mounted archery, armor parades, and sword demonstrations. Castle ruins stand quietly in city centers, their stone walls outlasting the governments that built them. Corporate culture, too, has inherited certain samurai traits, both admirable and troubling. The idea of total loyalty to one's company echoes feudal loyalty to a lord. Dedication, long hours, and group harmony are praised as virtues, much like the service and discipline expected of retainers in a daimyo's court. And in rural areas, descendants of samurai families still maintain shrines, heirlooms, and family histories stretching back centuries. For them, the warrior past isn't just a story, it's part of their identity.
The samurai spirit today.
Ask a Japanese person today what the samurai mean to them, and the answers will vary. Some will say discipline or honor. Others will laugh and mention anime heroes. A few might point to martial arts practice, where the etiquette of bowing, respect, and mental focus mirrors older warrior traditions. What's clear is that the samurai spirit, however reinterpreted, remains a living part of Japan's cultural DNA. It survives not because of swords or battles, but because the values it represents have been retold, repurposed, and reimagined for every generation.
A legacy that outlives the warrior.
In the end, the samurai's story is one of adaptation. They began as mounted archers in the service of provincial lords, became political elites under the shogunate, and were finally disbanded by the Meiji government. And yet, in art, philosophy, sport, and even corporate slogans, they endure. The world changes, black ships arrive, rifles replace swords, nations industrialize, but some symbols outlast the changes. For Japan, the samurai remain one of those symbols. They are a reminder of both the glory and the complexity of the past, and a lens through which Japan continues to see itself. The myths we keep, separating fact from fiction in samurai history. History is rarely neat. And the samurai's history? It's a tapestry where truth and myth are stitched so tightly together, you can't always tell where one ends and the other begins.
The Hollywood Samurai vs. The Real Thing.
In films, the samurai is a perfect warrior, honorable, poetic, unshakably loyal. He rides into battle without fear, cuts down his enemies with a single stroke, and delivers wise reflections in the glow of a paper lantern.
The truth is, messy.
Samurai were human. They could be brave, yes, but also political opportunists, backstabbers, and, on occasion, outright rebels against their lords. Loyalty was important, but it wasn't blind. Many samurai switched allegiances if it suited their survival or ambitions. Even Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a fixed code etched in stone for all time. It evolved, and at times, it was as much about appearances and rhetoric as genuine practice. Misconceptions about the sword. One of the most enduring myths is that the samurai's katana was the soul of the warrior. While the sword was deeply symbolic, for much of samurai history, their main battlefield weapon was the bow, and later, the spear. The katana was often a sidearm, used in close combat or as a badge of status in peacetime. Firearms, too, played a massive role in Japan's wars after the mid-16th century. The samurai adapted quickly, using arquebus to devastating effect in battles like Nagashino, 1575. The image of a sword-only warrior was partly a later romantic invention.
The Ronin Romance. Te enteres de Ronin, the masterly samurai, wandering the land.
Popular culture paints them as tragic heroes, wronged by fate, living by their own code. In reality, many Ronin struggled to survive, taking on work as mercenaries, guards, or even bandits. While some became legends, like the 47 Ronin who avenged their lord, many simply faded into obscurity. The romanticized Ronin is appealing because he embodies freedom and defiance. But historically, being masterless was often a hard, humiliating life.
Seppuku, ritual and reality.
Seppuku, the ritual suicide by disembowelment, is another element that pop culture has elevated to near-mythic levels. It is often portrayed as the ultimate act of honor, and in some cases, it was exactly that, a way to preserve dignity in defeat. But seppuku was also used as a form of capital punishment, ordered by a superior as a sentence. In those cases, the noble narrative fades, and what remains is a grim reminder of how the samurai's world could demand life as payment for failure or disobedience. The role of women. Popular imagination often leaves women out of the samurai story, except as wives or political pawns. But history tells us about onabugeisha, women of the warrior class trained to defend their homes and fight in times of war. Figures like Tomo Guzan, the 12th century warrior famed for her skill with the bow and sword, stand as reminders that the samurai era was not exclusively male. Still, these stories are rare in surviving records, partly because most histories were written by men, for men, with battlefield heroics in mind.
Why the myths endure?
So why do the clean, romantic versions of the samurai persist, even when historians have offered more nuanced accounts? Because myths serve a purpose. They inspire. They simplify. They give us a narrative we can hold in our hands. The idealized samurai, loyal, disciplined, and unwavering, offers a moral anchor in a chaotic world. The lone Ronin offers a model of independence. Even the tragic seppuku scene offers a poetic vision of integrity over compromise. The truth may be messier, but the myths give us something to aspire to, even if we can't, or shouldn't, replicate them exactly.
What the myths say about us.
In the end, the way we remember the samurai says as much about us as it does about them. The West embraced them as exotic knights, noble warriors in silk and steel. Japan reshaped their memory to suit the needs of nation-building, war, and later, cultural pride. Strip away the exaggerations, and what remains are people. Flawed, fascinating, driven by ambition, duty, fear, and hope. In other words, human.
Closing reflections.
The samurai walked off the stage of history more than 150 years ago, but their shadows still fall across Japan's culture, architecture, language, and imagination, and across the worlds. They remind us that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the values we choose to carry forward, and the stories we choose to tell. And as you set down the story of steel and silk, perhaps the real question isn't whether the samurai lived up to their myth, but whether we, in our own lives, live up to the ideals we romanticize.